The wall that was supposed to be holding up the second floor of my house had been cut clean through. I could see it the moment I pulled back enough of the drywall, a gap where the support was supposed to go. Nothing above it but the weight of the floor overhead, and nothing below it holding that weight up. No beam, no post, nothing. Just open air where the most important structural piece of that renovation was supposed to be. He told me to just trust the professionals. I was the professional he should have been worried about. I want to tell you exactly how I found that beam missing, and everything Dale Pruitt assumed about me before it cost him his contractor's license. But to get there, I have to take you back to the beginning. Back to the house. Back to the reason we bought it in the first place. Marcus and I had been looking for a house for almost 2 years before we found the one on Birchwood Drive. Not because we were picky. We were, a little. But because I knew what I was looking for in a way that most buyers don't. I'm a structural engineer. I've spent almost 15 years evaluating buildings for a living, looking at a house the way other people look at furniture. Not what it looks like on the surface, but what's underneath it, what's holding it up. Most houses built in the last 20 or 30 years are fine. They're built to code, they're built efficiently, and they're built fast. There's nothing wrong with that. But the houses from the 60s, the ones built before everything got standardized and mass-produced, they had a different kind of construction behind them. Heavier lumber, thicker walls. The kind of bones that, if the house has been maintained properly, will still be solid 60 years later. That's what I was looking for. Not charm, not a renovated kitchen. Bones. The house on Birchwood Drive had them. I knew it the first time I walked through. The floors didn't flex. The walls were true. The foundation was dry and even. Marcus asked me afterward what I thought, and I told him what I tell anyone who asks me to evaluate a structure. I told him it was solid. That's about as close to love at first sight as I get when it comes to buildings. The floor plan was the only real issue. The kitchen and the living room were split by a wall that ran almost the full width of the house, a wall that made both rooms feel smaller and darker than they needed to be. Removing it would open up the whole center of the house, more light, more space, the kind of open layout that the house deserved and that we wanted. I'd looked at the framing plan before we made our offer. I knew what removing that wall would involve. I knew it was load-bearing. That matters when a wall is load-bearing. It doesn't mean you can't remove it. It means you have to do it right. You have to replace what that wall is doing, supporting the weight of the floor above it, with something else. A beam. Properly sized, properly placed, properly supported at both ends. It's not complicated. Any contractor who's done a wall removal knows this. The math is straightforward. The process is straightforward. The permits are straightforward. There's no mystery to it. You just have to actually do it. Marcus asked me early on whether I was going to tell contractors up front what I did for a living. It was a reasonable question. I thought about it more than I expected to, and in the end, I decided not to. At least, not right away. Part of it was practical. I've been on job sites my whole career. I know what it feels like when someone shows up and immediately establishes that they're going to watch every single move you make. It puts people on edge. It changes the dynamic before the work has even started. I didn't want that. I wanted a contractor who felt trusted, who felt like he had room to do the job well, who wasn't defensive from day one because his client happened to have a relevant degree. And part of it, the part I didn't fully admit to myself at the time, was that I just wanted to feel like a normal homeowner for once. I spend my working hours in a hard hat, on scaffolding, in crawl spaces, evaluating other people's buildings. I wanted this renovation to feel like something different. I wanted to trust someone else with my own house. I wanted it to be simple. So I decided I'd ask the questions I would naturally ask as a careful, informed homeowner. Questions a person might ask after doing some reading online, after watching a few renovation videos, after talking to a neighbor who'd done something similar. I'd ask smart questions, but I'd ask them like someone learning, not like someone evaluating. If the contractor was competent, he'd give me good answers and I'd have nothing to worry about. If he wasn't, well, I'd know soon enough. We interviewed 4 contractors. Dale Pruitt was the third one we met. He came with references, 3 of them, homeowners who'd had renovations done, all of whom said he was reliable and did clean work. He'd been in business for over a decade. His quote was fair, not the lowest, but not inflated. He talked about the project clearly and confidently, without overselling it. He described the wall removal the way someone describes a thing they've done 100 times, which is what I wanted to hear. What I noticed about Dale, even then, was how he held himself in a conversation. He wasn't arrogant exactly, but he had a certain settled confidence in his own expertise, the kind of confidence that can look very much like competence from the outside. He answered questions fully. He made eye contact. He didn't hedge. I'd been in enough professional conversations to know that manner doesn't always mean knowledge, but it can be convincing. It was convincing enough. Marcus liked him immediately. Marcus is a good judge of people in the way that people who work with people every day tend to be. He reads warmth and reliability well. Dale was warm. He was easy to talk to. He made the whole project sound manageable and straightforward, and he wasn't wrong that it should be. We offered him the job at the end of that meeting. He said he could start in 3 weeks. Those first 3 weeks felt fine. The prep work was normal. Tarps and plastic sheeting over the furniture we'd left in place, the kitchen cleared out and moved into the dining room, the living room stripped back to its bones so Dale's crew could get at the wall. I came through each day after work and checked the progress. Everything was where it should be, and I told myself that was a good sign, that this was going to be simple. The day they started on the wall itself, I came home a little earlier than usual. I wanted to see the first stages of the removal, not because I was anxious, but because I was curious. This was my house. I'd looked at those framing plans. I wanted to see the moment the structure opened up. What I saw when I walked in was Dale's crew making the first cuts into the drywall. Clean work, careful cuts. Good. I stood back and watched for a few minutes, and then I asked Dale, the way I'd planned to, friendly, curious, like someone who had done some research, what the beam situation was going to look like, how it would be sized for this span, when it would be going in. He smiled. Not unkindly exactly, but with a particular kind of patience that I recognized immediately. The patience a person uses when they're explaining something they consider simple to someone they consider not very technical. He said the beam would go in once the wall was fully open, that it was all figured out, that I didn't need to worry about the specifics. I thanked him and didn't push it. I told myself he was busy. I told myself this was day 1 of the wall removal, and it was reasonable not to have every detail ready to walk me through at that exact moment. I told myself a lot of things. What I didn't tell myself, what I chose not to look at directly just yet, was that his answer hadn't actually contained an answer. He'd told me the beam would go in. He hadn't told me anything about what beam, what size, what calculation. He hadn't mentioned the permits. He hadn't mentioned the inspection timeline. He'd just told me not to worry. And I had let it go. I let that first answer go. I had no idea at the time that it was only the beginning of a pattern that would take weeks to fully reveal itself. The next time I saw the wall, it was open, not finished, not framed. Just a wide gap running from the kitchen side to the living room side, studs cut away, dust still settled on the floor underneath it. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I said anything. I asked Dale, the way I'd practiced asking things in my head on the drive home, easy, curious, like a homeowner who'd read one article too many. I asked him what size beam he was planning to use, and how he was going to support it at each end. I remember his exact words. He said the beam was already picked out, that it would be sized right, and that this was the kind of thing that was second nature to him after 10 years in the business. He told me I didn't need to worry about the math. He said it the way you'd talk to a kid asking how an airplane stays in the air. It wasn't a wrong answer, exactly. It just wasn't an answer. He hadn't told me the span. He hadn't told me the load. He hadn't told me anything I could check against what I already knew from the framing plan sitting in a folder on my kitchen counter. I thanked him again and let it go again. That was becoming a pattern of its own, me asking, him deflecting, me deciding it wasn't the right moment to push. I told myself I was being patient. Looking back, I think I was hoping the next answer would be different, even though nothing about his tone gave me a reason to think that. A few days later, I asked about the permit. Not as a challenge, just a simple question, the kind anyone who'd watched even one renovation show would think to ask. I asked when the inspector was scheduled to come look at the wall before it got closed up. He told me the permit was in process, that the county was slow this time of year, and that he'd had inspectors come after the fact plenty of times without any trouble. He said it so easily, like it was just how things worked, like I should already know that. I did know how things worked. That's exactly why the answer bothered me. An inspector is supposed to see the structural work before it gets covered up, not after. Once drywall goes back over a beam, you can't see what's actually holding the floor up anymore. You can only see what someone tells you is back there. I didn't say any of that to him. I said something small, something that sounded like simple agreement. I told myself I'd bring it up again once the wall was further along, when there'd be something specific in front of us to talk about, instead of a plan that still lived only in his head. That night, I told Marcus about the conversation. Not in a panicked way, just talking it through the way you talk through your day with the person who shares your house. I told him the permit timing felt off to me, and that Dale's answer about the beam still hadn't actually told me anything. Marcus listened the way he always does, fully, without interrupting. He asked me if I thought something was actually wrong, or if I was just being careful because of what I do for a living. It was a fair question. I didn't have a clean answer for him yet. I told him I didn't know yet. That was the truth. I had a feeling, the kind that comes from 15 years of looking at buildings, but a feeling isn't proof. Marcus squeezed my hand and told me he trusted my instincts, but he also reminded me that he couldn't tell good contractor talk from bad contractor talk the way I could. He wasn't going to be able to back me up with details, only with support. That was the first time I felt something close to alone in this. Not because Marcus wasn't there for me, he was, completely, but because the specific kind of doubt I was carrying needed a person who spoke the same technical language I did. And Marcus, for all his steadiness, wasn't that person. I needed someone who could tell me I wasn't imagining a problem that wasn't there. That's when I thought of Renata. Renata and I had gone through our engineering program together, years ago, back when we were two of the only women in most of our classes. She'd stayed in structural work the same way I had, and we still called each other every few months, the way old friends do when the friendship doesn't need maintaining to stay solid. I called her on a Saturday afternoon while Marcus was out running errands. I laid it out for her plainly, the way I'd lay out a project for a colleague. The load-bearing wall, the vague answer about the beam, the permit that supposedly existed but had no inspection scheduled. I remember Renata going quiet for a second before she spoke. She asked me one direct question. She asked if I'd actually seen the beam specs anywhere, on paper, with numbers on them. I told her no. She said that was the part that worried her, more than anything else I'd described. Hearing her say it out loud, in that same flat, professional tone I use myself when I'm reviewing someone else's work, did something for me. It wasn't new information. It was the same concern I'd already had. But it stopped feeling like my own private anxiety and started feeling like a legitimate professional flag, the kind I'd raise without hesitation on any other job site in the world. Renata told me something I held on to for the rest of that renovation. She said that contractors who actually have the numbers love to show them off, because numbers make them look careful and competent. Contractors who don't have the numbers talk around them instead, with confidence standing in for proof. She said the confidence was the tell, not the lack of it. I thought about that for days afterward. Dale had plenty of confidence. What he didn't have, as far as I could see, was a single piece of paper he'd shown me with an actual calculation on it. The following week I tried a different question, still careful, still framed like a homeowner's curiosity. I asked if I could see the beam spec sheet, just so I'd understand what was going into my own house. He told me he didn't usually walk homeowners through paperwork like that it would just be confusing, and that I should focus on the parts of the renovation I'd actually enjoy, like picking out the flooring. He said it warmly, almost like a compliment, like he was sparing me something tedious. It wasn't said cruelly. That was almost the hardest part. If he'd been rude about it, I think I would have pushed back immediately. Instead, he was pleasant, easy, dismissive in the gentlest possible way, the kind of dismissiveness that's almost impossible to call out without sounding unreasonable yourself. I let it sit for a day before I said anything to Marcus. When I did, I told him plainly that I thought Dale was avoiding showing me actual numbers, not because he didn't think I'd understand them, but because I suspected there weren't real numbers to show. Marcus asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wasn't ready to confront anything yet. I didn't have proof. I had a pattern of vague answers and a permit that might or might not exist. I told him I wanted to keep watching, keep asking, and start writing things down properly instead of just noticing them and moving on. That was the moment I started keeping a notebook. Nothing dramatic, just dates and what Dale had told me on each of those dates, in his own words as closely as I could remember them. The beam comment, the permit comment, the spec sheet comment. 3 short entries that, taken together, were starting to form a shape I didn't like. Around that same time, the crew started framing in the new opening. From a distance, it looked like progress. Lumber going up, the shape of the new doorway between kitchen and living room beginning to take form. If you didn't know what you were looking at, it looked exactly like a renovation moving forward the way it should. I knew what I was looking at, and what I saw bothered me more than anything Dale had said out loud. The header going in above the new opening looked thin to me. Not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice walking past it, but thin enough that the engineer in me did a quiet, instinctive calculation in my head and didn't like the number that came out. I asked Dale about it directly that same afternoon. I asked what size lumber that header was, framed again as simple homeowner curiosity, the kind of question you'd ask just to understand your own house a little better. He told me it was sized exactly right for the span, that he'd done bigger openings than this one without any issue, and that I shouldn't worry myself over something that was, in his words, basic carpentry math. Basic carpentry math has an answer, a specific one, tied to the span and the load above it. He still hadn't given me that answer. He'd given me confidence again, dressed up to look like an answer. That night I called Renata a second time. I described the header, the size I thought I was looking at, and the span it was meant to cross. She didn't tell me I was wrong. She told me, carefully, that if my read on the dimensions was right, it sounded undersized for that span, and that it was absolutely worth getting a second look from someone with no stake in the project at all. I didn't argue with her. I didn't need to. Everything she said matched what I already suspected, and hearing it confirmed from someone outside my own head made the next step feel less like overreacting and more like simply doing my job, even if nobody else in this story understood that I had a job that applied here. I went to bed that night thinking about the notebook on my nightstand, 3 short entries already inside it, and I knew, without any drama in the thought, that there were going to be more. I let those early comments go, one after another, and told myself each time that I was simply being patient. I had no idea, looking back, that patience was about to run out on its own on a Tuesday afternoon I didn't see coming. The Tuesday I'm talking about started like any other day on the job site. I'd left work a little early, the way I'd started doing more often than I wanted to admit, and I came home to find Dale alone in the living room, measuring something near the new opening. I'd had time to think by then about how I wanted to ask my next question. I didn't want it vague anymore. I wanted it specific enough that a real answer would be obvious if it existed, and a non-answer would be just as obvious if it didn't. I asked him directly what the actual size of the beam was, in inches, and what it was resting on at each end of the opening. Not what kind of beam, not whether it was sized right, the actual dimensions and the actual bearing points. I remember the exact moment his expression changed. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something closer to surprise. The look of a man who just realized the question in front of him was sharper than the questions he'd been hearing all along. He paused before he answered, longer than he had with any of my earlier questions. Then he said something I will never forget. He said I was asking a lot of very specific questions for a homeowner, and that most people just let him do his job. I felt that comment land somewhere behind my ribs. Not because it was loud or cruel, because of exactly how calm it was, how reasonable it sounded out loud, while still managing to tell me, plainly, that my questions were a problem rather than a right. I didn't say anything sharp back to him in that moment. I told him, evenly, that I just like to understand my own house. He nodded, the way you nod at someone you've decided to be patient with, and went back to his measuring. I went into the kitchen afterward and stood there for a minute, just breathing. Not upset exactly, something steadier than that. A kind of clarity settling into place, the feeling of a decision being made somewhere underneath the part of my mind that does the talking. I knew, standing in that kitchen, that I wasn't going to keep asking polite questions and hoping for honest answers. I needed proof, now. Not because I'd been offended, because a man who gets defensive about being asked for basic dimensions is a man who very likely doesn't have those dimensions written down anywhere. That night I told Marcus what Dale had said, word for word, the way I'd remembered it walking through the kitchen. Marcus went quiet for a second, and then he asked me, gently, if he wanted to step in and say something to Dale directly. I told him no, not yet. I appreciated the offer more than I could easily explain, but this wasn't a problem that needed a husband stepping in to defend his wife's feelings. It was a problem that needed documentation, the kind that would hold up regardless of who was looking at it. I told Marcus I was going to start keeping a real record, not just notes in a notebook anymore, but photos, dates, and as close to exact wording as I could manage for everything Dale told me going forward. Marcus nodded and told me he'd help however I needed. He started taking his own photos on his phone too, on days he got home before I did, without me even asking him to. Over the next 2 weeks, I built that record carefully. I photographed the framed opening from 3 angles every few days, so there'd be a visible timeline of what the structure looked like at each stage. I wrote down every date Dale gave me for the inspection, and every time that date quietly moved without explanation. I counted 4 separate times that the inspection date shifted. Each time, Dale had a reasonable-sounding excuse. The county was backed up, the inspector had canceled, the paperwork had a small error that needed correcting. Reasonable excuses, one at a time. Strung together, they told a different story. I called Renata again during that stretch, mostly just to talk it through out loud with someone who'd understand the weight of what I was describing. I told her about the 4 delayed inspections. She didn't hesitate before she said what she thought. She told me that in her experience, a project that gets covered up before inspection, again and again, usually has something behind the wall that someone doesn't want an inspector to see. I didn't want to believe that about my own renovation. But I also couldn't think of a version of events where 4 delayed inspections and a defensive answer about beam dimensions added up to nothing at all. Around that same time, I started paying closer attention to small things I might have overlooked before. The way Dale's crew left certain areas of the framing covered with plastic sheeting longer than seemed necessary. The way he always found a reason to walk me toward the kitchen cabinets or the flooring samples whenever I lingered too long near the new opening. None of those things were proof on their own. Together, they read like a man managing what I was allowed to see, rather than simply doing his job and letting me watch. I asked him, one more time, for the permit number itself, so I could look it up on the county website myself. This wasn't a vague request anymore. It was specific, and it was the kind of thing that's either true or isn't, with no room for confident deflection. He told me the number was at his office, that he'd bring it by the next time he came, and that I really didn't need to be the one tracking permit numbers, since that was his responsibility, not mine. I told him, evenly, that I understood it was his responsibility, and that I'd still like the number when he had it. He said he would. He never brought it. I want to be honest about something here. I still hadn't told him what I did for a living. Marcus asked me, more than once during those weeks, why I hadn't simply said it outright and ended the guessing game. I told him I wasn't ready to. I think the truer answer is that some part of me was waiting for one more piece of proof, something undeniable, before I said it out loud and changed the entire shape of this relationship for good. I started planning, quietly, for the moment when the wall would finally be open enough for me to see the support structure directly, with my own eyes, instead of relying on Dale's description of it. I didn't tell him I was planning that. I simply waited for my chance. I did not tell him what I actually did for a living that day in the living room. I told myself I was still giving him room to do the right thing on his own. Looking back, I think I was simply gathering proof, one quiet observation at a time, for a conversation I already knew was coming. The chance I'd been waiting for came on a Thursday morning, when Marcus and I both happened to be home at the same time, in between a delayed delivery of cabinets and a crew that hadn't shown up yet. I told Marcus I wanted 10 minutes alone in the living room before anyone arrived. He didn't ask me why. He just handed me his phone flashlight and told me to go look. The drywall on one side of the new opening was still half off, left over from the framing work, with just enough insulation pulled back that I could see straight into the wall cavity if I got close and used the flashlight. I'd been waiting for this exact window. Not to go looking for trouble, to finally see for myself what the last several weeks of vague answers had been covering up. What I found was exactly what I'd been afraid of finding. There was no beam spanning the opening. None. Where a properly sized beam should have been sitting, resting on solid support at both ends, there was nothing but a gap, with the weight of the floor above held up by nothing more than the temporary framing meant to last only until real support went in. That temporary framing was still there. It was the only thing there. I want to explain this plainly, the way I'd explain it to anyone who hasn't spent years thinking about how buildings hold themselves up. That wall, the one Dale's crew had cut open, used to carry part of the weight of the floor above it. Every house built the way this one was works like a series of transfers. Load from above passes down through walls and beams and posts and finally into the foundation. When you cut a hole in a load-bearing wall, you're interrupting one of those transfers. Something else has to take over. That something is a beam, sized specifically for the span and the load, sitting on proper supports at each end. That beam simply wasn't there. I didn't panic. I want to be clear about that. I'd spent 15 years walking into situations exactly like this one, buildings where work had been done wrong, where the math hadn't been done or had been done carelessly, where what was behind the wall didn't match what anyone had claimed was behind the wall. I'd written reports about it. I'd sat in meetings where contractors argued that everything was fine, and I'd held my ground, calmly, with documentation, and I'd been right. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I just had never been looking at it in my own house before. I took photos. Careful ones, with the flashlight angled so the gap was unmistakable, so there'd be no question looking at them later about what was present and what wasn't. I photographed the opening from 2 different positions. I noted the date in my notebook, the time, what the site looked like when I arrived. I did all of this in under 10 minutes, quietly, without disturbing anything. I didn't want Dale's crew to come in and see that someone had been looking closely. Not yet. Marcus was waiting in the kitchen when I came back. He looked at my face and didn't ask any questions for a moment. He just waited. That's one of the things I've always appreciated about him, the ability to let a moment sit without filling it up immediately. I put the phone down on the counter between us and pulled up the photos. I told him what he was looking at and what it meant. I kept it simple, not because I didn't think he could handle the technical detail, but because the situation itself was simple. There was supposed to be a beam. There wasn't one. The floor above that opening was sitting on framing that was never meant to hold it long term. Marcus looked at the photos for a long moment and then looked up at me. He asked the question I'd been waiting for him to ask. He asked if this meant the house was actually unsafe right now, today, with us living in it. I told him the truth. I told him the part of the house directly above that opening wasn't being properly supported, and that while it likely wasn't going to fail instantly, the temporary framing was still doing something. It also wasn't something we could responsibly leave alone for even one more week. Structures that are bearing more than they're designed to bear don't always fail dramatically. Sometimes they settle. Sometimes they crack. Sometimes nothing visible happens for months, and then something does. I wasn't willing to wait to find out which kind of situation this was. Marcus nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've thought about more than once since that morning. He told me he was glad I'd trusted my instincts the whole way through, even when neither of us had proof yet. He said it simply, without making a big thing of it. It mattered more than he probably knew. I decided that same night that my own professional judgment wasn't going to be enough on its own to take this forward. Not because I doubted what I'd seen, I didn't, not for a second, but because I knew exactly how this would look from the outside if it became a formal dispute. A homeowner with a structural engineering background, finding a problem in her own house with no outside confirmation. Any competent lawyer or licensing board would look at that and ask for an independent assessment. I wanted to have one ready before anyone asked. I called the licensed building inspector the next morning, one with no connection to Dale, no connection to me, no stake in the outcome either way. I found him through the county's own list of registered inspectors. When I called, I didn't tell him what I did for a living. I described myself as a homeowner who was worried about the structural work on her renovation, and I asked him if he could come take a direct look. He said he could come in 2 days. I told him that was fine. Those 2 days felt longer than most of the weeks that had come before them. I went to work, I came home, I kept my distance from Dale and his crew, and I let them work without saying anything that would tip off that something was happening. Dale came by once during that window, and I had a perfectly ordinary conversation with him about the cabinet hardware. I smiled in the right places. I asked about the timeline. I acted like a homeowner who was still waiting patiently for things to be finished. It was the most professional performance I'd given in a long time, and nobody in that room knew it. The inspector came on a morning when Dale wasn't scheduled to be there. I walked him to the opening, pointed out what I'd seen, showed him the photos on my phone, and then I stepped back and let him work. I didn't stand over him. I didn't guide him toward any particular conclusion. I wanted his eyes on the structure without my interpretation coloring what he saw. It took him under 20 minutes. He came back into the kitchen, set his clipboard on the counter, and told me plainly what he'd found. The opening had no adequate support installed. The load above it was being carried by framing that was never designed to bear that weight on a long-term basis. In his assessment, this was a serious concern, not a minor one, and it needed to be corrected before the space could be considered safe for normal use. He used careful, professional language. He didn't need to dress it up. The facts were sufficient on their own. He didn't stop at the beam. Once he was looking closely at one area of the work, he looked at the rest of it too, which is what a thorough inspector does. The permit Dale had repeatedly promised to show me didn't exist in the county system. Not pending, not recently approved, not applied for under a slightly different address or variation of the project description. It simply wasn't there. 2 electrical updates made earlier in the renovation, updates I hadn't even been focused on because the beam had taken up all my attention, had also never been inspected. Every formal safeguard the renovation was supposed to have gone through had been skipped or simply never initiated. He wrote everything up in a formal report, specific and plain, the kind that doesn't leave room for creative reinterpretation. I sat at my kitchen table that afternoon and read it twice. There was a particular feeling that settled in my chest when I finished the second reading. Not satisfaction exactly, and not relief either. It was something closer to the feeling of a thing being confirmed that you already knew was true. The weight of uncertainty I'd been carrying for weeks had a shape now, and it was exactly the shape I'd been afraid it was. I called Dale that same evening. I kept my voice even, the way I'd kept it even through every conversation we'd had since the first day he'd told me not to worry about the specifics. I told him I needed to talk to him in person, at the house, as soon as he could come by. He asked if everything was all right. I told him I just had some questions I wanted to go through with him face to face. He said he could come the next afternoon. I said that would be fine. He arrived the following afternoon with the same easy posture I'd noticed at our very first meeting, the relaxed confidence of a man who'd walked into 100 homeowner conversations and come out the other side without much trouble. He set his jacket over the back of a chair and asked what I wanted to talk about. I told him I'd had an inspection done on the opening. I watched something shift in his expression, something brief and tight, before the easy manner came back. I put the inspection report on the kitchen counter between us. I told him plainly what it said. No beam, no permit in the county system, 2 uninspected electrical updates. I kept my voice flat and professional, the same tone I use when I'm reviewing someone else's work and the findings aren't good. I watched him read through the first page. His expression shifted from confidence to something tighter and more careful as he read. He told me this was an overreaction. He said these things happen on every job, that permitting timelines are unpredictable, that he could fix the beam situation without any real trouble, and that I was treating what he called a normal construction hiccup, like some kind of disaster. His voice stayed easy and reasonable, the same tone that had convinced me and Marcus to hire him in the first place. It was a very practiced tone. It just didn't work anymore. That was the moment I told him what I actually did for a living. Not loudly, not with any particular build-up. I said it the way I'd say it in any professional context where it was relevant, plainly, without apology, as a simple statement of fact. I told him I was a licensed structural engineer, that I'd spent almost 15 years evaluating exactly this kind of work, that I'd recognized what was wrong with that wall from the very first vague answer he'd given me weeks ago, and that everything I'd asked him since had been a professional assessment, not a homeowner's anxiety. He went quiet for a long moment. The easy confidence drained out of him in a way that was almost visible, like watching the air leave a room. Then he said the thing I'd been waiting for weeks to hear him say out loud. His exact words were that he thought I was just asking a lot of questions for a homeowner. He said it almost involuntarily, like it slipped out before he could decide whether to say it. I told him he'd been right about one thing. I had been asking a lot of questions. He'd simply been wrong about who he was answering them for. I told him what would happen next. The inspection report would be filed formally with the county building department and with the state contractor licensing board. The structural work would need to be fully corrected by a properly licensed contractor before any further progress on the renovation could move forward. The cost of that correction would be his responsibility, not ours. I wasn't asking him. I was telling him, in the same flat, professional voice I'd use with anyone whose work failed a review. He didn't argue much after that. There wasn't much left to argue. The report was specific. The violations were documented. The confident tone that had carried him through every earlier conversation had nowhere left to go. He said a few things, that he'd thought the permit situation was being handled by someone else on his end, that the beam was something he'd been about to address, but the words came out without the weight they needed, and both of us knew it. He told me to just trust the professionals, weeks earlier, in this very room. I thought about that comment again as he left that afternoon, and I let myself feel, for the first time in a long time, something close to solid ground. I had trusted the right professional the entire time. It just hadn't been him. The days after Dale left that afternoon were not quiet, exactly, but they had a different quality to them than the weeks that had come before. The uncertainty was gone. What replaced it was a long list of things that needed to be done, and I've always found it easier to work through a list than to sit with something I can't resolve yet. So I worked through the list. I filed the inspection report with the county building department first. That was the practical starting point. They needed to know about the work that had been done without permits, because permits aren't bureaucratic formality. They're the mechanism by which a community says that a building is safe enough for the people who live in it. Dale had skipped that mechanism entirely, and the county needed to know. I also filed a formal complaint with the State Contractor Licensing Board. I want to be clear about what that process actually looks like, because people sometimes imagine it as something more dramatic than it is. It's paperwork. It's a written account of what happened, supported by documentation. In this case, the inspection report, the photographs Marcus and I had taken, the dated notebook entries, the record of 4 inspection dates that had each quietly come and gone without anything actually being inspected. I submitted it all, organized and specific, and then I waited for the board to do their work. The outcome wasn't instant. These things rarely are. The board has a process, and that process takes time. What I can tell you is that Dale Pruitt's contractor's license was ultimately suspended following their review. I found that out through a letter several months later, in the same plain, official language that these things always arrive in. I read it once and set it down. There was no particular feeling of triumph in it. There was, mostly, the feeling of a thing having concluded the way it was supposed to. The renovation itself was a different kind of complicated. Having work corrected after the fact costs more than having it done right the first time. It always does, because you're paying twice for the same result. Marcus and I sat down with the numbers and talked it through the way we talk through everything. Plainly, without pretending the situation was better or worse than it was. The cost was significant. We managed it. What mattered more to both of us than the money was that when the renovation was done for real, it would be done right. We hired a new contractor through a process that was, perhaps, slightly more rigorous than most homeowners go through. I asked every question up front, and I didn't frame any of them as a curious homeowner trying not to sound too informed. I told the contractors we interviewed exactly what I did for a living. Every single one of them. I wanted anyone bidding on this job to know from the first conversation that the person evaluating their work would understand what she was looking at. Most of them took it in stride. A couple of them visibly relaxed when I said it, the way people relax when they find out the person across the table actually understands the subject. One of them, the one we eventually hired, a woman named Patricia who'd been running her own contracting business for 12 years, told me it made her job easier, not harder, when a client understood the technical side. She said the jobs that went wrong were almost always the jobs where no one on the homeowner's side knew what questions to ask. Patricia pulled the permits before any work started. She showed me the beam specifications on paper, with numbers, before she ordered the materials. She walked me through every structural decision as it was made, not because she had to, but because she seemed to genuinely enjoy working with someone who understood what she was explaining. It was a completely different experience. Not easier exactly. Renovations are never easy, but honest, which made it feel manageable in a way the first one never had. The beam went in on a Wednesday. I was home for it. I watched Patricia's crew install it properly, the right size, the right bearing points, resting on supports that were built to carry the load they were carrying. The inspector came out the same week, while the framing was still open, the way it's supposed to happen. He signed off without any issues. I stood in the living room afterward, looked at the opening between the kitchen and the living room, and felt, for the first time, exactly what I'd imagined when we'd bought this house. More light, more space. The bones of a 60-year-old house doing exactly what they were built to do. It was around that time that I called Renata. Not because anything required it. Everything was resolved. The complaint was filed. The renovation was moving forward properly. I called because she'd been part of this from the beginning, and the beginning deserved an ending that she knew about. We talked for a while. She asked about the beam, the inspector, Patricia, all the practical things. And then she asked me something I hadn't expected. She asked if I thought Dale would have treated me differently at the start if I'd walked in and introduced myself as a structural engineer on the first day. I thought about that for a moment before I answered. I told her honestly that I didn't think so. Not because my credentials would have changed nothing, but because the thing that was driving his behavior wasn't ignorance of my qualifications. It was a certain, settled assumption about what kind of person he was dealing with, and a credential doesn't always dislodge an assumption that comfortable. Renata was quiet for a second, and then she said something that stayed with me. She said that what bothered her most about the whole situation wasn't the missing beam. It was the pattern underneath it. The way every question I'd asked had been treated as something to be managed rather than something to be answered. She said she'd had versions of the same experience herself, on job sites and in meetings, years of them, and she thought the specific exhaustion of it was something that most people without that direct experience couldn't fully account for. The exhaustion of being correct and still having to prove it. I knew exactly what she meant. The technical knowledge I have isn't something I wear lightly. I've spent almost 15 years building it, and I've spent almost as long navigating rooms where I had to demonstrate it before it would be taken seriously. Rooms where someone else's confidence was treated as equivalent to my expertise, simply because they looked more like the person expected to have expertise. The renovation was an extreme version of something I'd already encountered in smaller ways for most of my career. What made it different was that this time, it was my own house. I told Renata something I'd been thinking about for a while by then. I told her that one of the things I'd struggled with, in the weeks when Dale was dismissing my questions, was the temptation to simply reveal my background and watch the dynamic change. I'd had that card in my hand the whole time. I'd chosen not to play it, and I'd second-guessed that choice more than once, especially on the harder days. What I understood better now, looking back, was that the choice to hold it back hadn't been weakness. It had been methodology. I'd been gathering evidence the way I would on any professional review, systematically, without tipping my hand, letting the work reveal itself before I formed a final assessment. That was the right approach. It just hadn't felt like it in the middle of it. The house on Birchwood Drive looks the way I always knew it could look, now. The kitchen and the living room are one space, open and light, the way we'd imagined it when we'd made the offer 2 years ago. The beam is there, properly sized, properly installed, properly inspected. Marcus makes coffee in the morning and sets it on the counter by the window, and the whole center of the house feels like it breathes differently than it did when we moved in. That's what a renovation that's done right feels like. Not dramatic, just right. I still think about Dale sometimes, not with anger. The anger burned off a long time ago, but with a kind of professional curiosity about how someone gets to a point where shortcuts become the default, where skipping the formal steps feels like efficiency rather than risk. I don't have a satisfying answer for that. I think about the homeowners before me, the ones who'd given Dale good references, who hadn't known what questions to ask or hadn't felt entitled to push when they didn't get real answers. I hope their work held up. I have no way of knowing. Marcus asked me, a few months after everything was finished, whether I regretted any part of how I'd handled it. He didn't mean the complaint or the inspector. He meant the whole thing. The choice to hold back my credentials at the beginning, the weeks of careful questions, the notebook on the nightstand. I told him I didn't. Not because it went perfectly. It didn't. It cost us more time and money than it ever should have. But the record I built was the reason the outcome was as clean as it was. The documentation held up. The complaint was credible. The board had what they needed to act. That doesn't happen if you go in swinging from the first day and let the other person shape the narrative of what happened. What I've carried with me from this, more than anything else, is something simple. I trusted my training. Not loudly, not visibly, not in a way anyone on that job site would have recognized for what it was. I asked the questions my training told me to ask. I documented what my training told me to document. I sought outside confirmation because my training told me that outside confirmation protects everyone, including yourself. And when the moment came to say plainly who I was and what I knew, I said it, calmly, without apology, with 15 years of evidence standing behind every word. He told me to trust the professionals. I did. I just happened to be one of them.